Welcome to our experts' discussion on the risks currently facing primary care networks and how incorporation can help alleviate these. I'm joined by Sarah Elms, who is a specialist healthcare partner from the Accountants and Business Advisors BDO, and Nils Christiansen, who is the managing partner of the specialist healthcare law firm DR Solicitors. Welcome to you both. I know both firms have PCN clients who are planning to incorporate, and you've both been having lots of conversations about this recently. We thought it would be useful to share this conversation more widely. So, on the call, we'll be exploring the issues with PCNs as they are currently constructed and whether incorporation is a viable solution for other PCNs. Nils, what do you see as some of the main issues with the current PCN model?
Well, the PCNs were set up over a year ago now in a very informal way. And that was great because it started them off and everybody got going. We got the whole country going in double quick time in a matter of months. Quite astonishingly, all these PCNs were created, but they were created as cost sharing groups, cost sharing arrangements with no new entities, simply sharing things between the existing entities. Now, that works at a small scale. But as you start to grow, you start creating risks and issues which can develop into bigger problems. So those include things like the risk of creating a partnership. And we all heard of the partnership at will problem in practices. You could create one of those. Also, if you go on the lead practice model, well, that makes sense at a small scale. But if you suddenly got 10, 15 ARS resources in a single practice, that can cause concerns for that practice, quite understandably. Or you may have gone down a flat practice model route and shared resources between a number of practices, but then suddenly differences are going to emerge in those employment models between the different practices. Then there's the VAT issue, which is been well aired over the course of the last year. That's a big issue in PCNs, and it gets bigger as the PCNs get larger. Then there's more money which is flowing down the pipe to PCNs. Well, where does that go to? Because there is no entity called a PCN. So how do you contract within the PCN with that new money? Next, you've got governance issues which start emerging because you've got an awful lot of money. It's within a short time, there's going to be £1 million probably in your average PCN. You've got governance around that kind of money, which becomes a big issue. When you don't have a structure, you don't have a legal entity to contain that. How do you manage that kind of money, and how do you manage the decision making around processes at that scale? Next, you've got the question of unlimited liability. Obviously, you've got a large business, a large joint venture, which is between practices who don't really know each other that well, and yet they're all unlimited liability practices. And with £1 million flowing through, that can begin to become uncomfortable. And lastly is the question of how to pay the clinical director, which I know many CDs get concerned about.
Thanks, Nils. Sarah, as Nils mentioned, I know that VAT has been a really hot topic for PCNs since they started, and this is a big worry. Can you tell us a bit more about how incorporation might help this?
Yeah, sure. So VAT certainly is a big issue that every PCN wants to talk about and wants resolution on. So how incorporation would work is it makes the PCN a separate legal entity rather than just a collection of GP practices effectively working together. And that opens up the possibility of being treated as what's called a VAT cost sharing group, which in turn that means that the supply of services to the PCN member practices, so by the staff employed by the PCN, wouldn't be subject to VAT. So it kind of takes that question off the table. Now, there's no kind of separate setup required as such to get this cost sharing group in place. But there are 7 conditions that need to be satisfied for each and every supply that the PCN makes to its member practices. So you kind of need to think about this in terms of every supply, every transaction that you undertake with your member practices, rather than the VAT creating like a blanket exemption. Now, whilst when you look at the 7 conditions, most of them are pretty straightforward. So as an example, one of them is it must be a supply of services rather than a supply of goods. So those kind of things are fairly straightforward in this case. But there are some of those criteria which are a little bit more problematic in practice. And whilst they're not insurmountable, they do still need close monitoring to ensure that you don't inadvertently fail one of the conditions and then risk being back into 20% VAT. So, by way of example, one of those conditions is that the cost sharing group must merely claim from its member practices the exact reimbursement of their share of joint expenses. So you need to take real care on this, because whilst it's that's okay to do, you need to have really robust records to make sure that that is exactly what is happening, and that you don't fall foul of that and get it wrong on there. So I guess in summary, the incorporation and a cost sharing group for VAT could well resolve the VAT issue, as long as you're mindful about the kind of the robust records and making sure that these conditions are always met, because the VAT exemption is not automatic; it's on a supply by supply basis. So it's been an interesting area actually, and I've had a lot of conversations recently about VAT with PCNs. Um, Through discussions with some of my specialist VAT partners at BDO, we actually think that there might be a better solution to the VAT problem, which actually negates the need to have the VAT cost sharing group anyway, which would mean that you don't need to monitor against these supply conditions all of the time. And hopefully it would take away some of the uncertainty about the VAT status of these transactions that's there at the moment. So we're talking to a number of our PCN clients about this and the best way to try to take that forwards. But yeah, I just kind of mentioned that is we're looking at a couple of different options on there.
Thanks, Sarah. That would be really interesting to see if a better solution can be reached on the VAT position. Turning now to the governance issues, Nils.
Yes. So as I said, I guess at the beginning, when things were small scale, then governance really wasn't such an issue, because you're talking one or two resources and a significant amount of money, but not too much money, and you could do that very much part time. As things get bigger, that isn't so easy. You've suddenly got a lot of money sitting in probably a practice account as a nominated payees account somewhere, being managed by who, because it's shared money. You've also got staff who are shared staff who are again being managed by who. You've got decisions being made by committee for a business, and it is effectively a business of up to £1 million turnover, with no real structure around it. There's no clarity other than what it says in the PCN agreement. And I'm very well aware that many PCNs actually just filled in templates for their PCN agreements for managing a business of £1 million with no corporate structure around it. At least if you have when you incorporate, what you have then is you have all the benefit of company law. Think of it as a fence around that entity. It's very clear what's in the entity, what's not in the entity, and you get free of charge a governance structure of having directors, shareholders, and the entity is allowed to own things. So it's also allowed to employ staff. It becomes much clearer who employs the staff, because that's actually the entity. So by incorporating, you automatically get this governance structure which doesn't exist within an ordinary PCN, PCNs as they're set up today. You can certainly create them through your PCN agreement, but then it's only going to be as good as the PCN agreement itself. And secondly, even if you have a really good PCN agreement, it's only a contractual arrangement. So there's no statute sitting behind it saying this is the entity, this is the governance around it, this is the way to run things. So as things get bigger, it's basically really, really useful to have that built-in governance. But you've then got to make sure that you can link that back to the PCN, which doesn't go away. The PCN still exists as an agreement between practices, but then they deliver that agreement through an incorporated entity, and you've got to link those two together. So that becomes really important.
Thanks, Nils. Obviously, clinical directors play a big part in setting the governance for the PCN, but what about their employment position? Sarah, are you able to tell us some more on this?
Yeah, so a lot of the questions that I have, a lot of the discussions I have around this at the moment is actually if there is an employment relationship, who is that between? And in some senses, actually establishing the PCN as a separate legal entity may formalise that relationship, because the clinical director can then be employed by this separate legal entity. So it might actually make it a little bit clearer for people if it was sort of an employment relationship that they were looking at kind of crystallising in there. I think more the point though with the clinical director role is looking at actually what they're doing. As if they're doing things which are connected to the DES, which could be a provision of kind of clinical services and clinical direction, then it could be that actually that is a supply of the actual services rather than actually being an employment as such as a director or an officer. So I think actually the specific circumstances need to be looked at. But if the structure of the PCN either now or in the future is one where national insurance should be paid, then the PCN is bearing a risk if they're not applying this. And if you think about the combined rates of employee and employer national insurance at what 25.8%, this can quickly become quite a significant cost. So there is definitely a cost of the PCNs at the moment if they're not applying an employment structure and it should be in place. However, I think there's probably some PCNs at the moment who have automatically applied, assumed that this is an employment relationship where it might not be. And therefore, they could have equally overpaid national insurance on that and could be reclaims with HMRC. So I think it's very much that the specific relationship and what that clinical director is doing needs to be looked at. And that's very much on a case by case basis. But actually, I do believe that having this separate legal structure helps to actually create that the legal entity helps because you've got a body that can actually employ that individual. But much wider than the clinical director role is that a separate legal entity also means that the rest of the staff can be employed by the PCN, and that makes it a lot easier because they're all in one place, and it's much better, in my opinion, for the management of HR risks.
So, can staff be employed by the PCN and still be members of the NHS pension scheme? As I thought that wasn't allowed.
Yeah, so originally they couldn't, which was kind of a real showstopper for any thoughts about incorporation or anything like that. And that was really why these staff were employed by the various different practices, or often the lead practice. Um, but that position has changed. If the PCN incorporates, it could apply to the scheme access team for a temporary direction or a determination status. And the slightly different ones are according to the different NHS pension schemes involved. So that is due to last until 31st of March 2021, but it's expected that temporary provision will be extended. So yes, they should be able to.
Thanks, Sarah. And Nils, can you elaborate on that point about the management of HR risks for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because obviously the PCN has got a lot to do with employment, because that's well, most of the money is about is employing additional resources. And I totally agree with Sarah about the, moving the resources, moving the staff into a place where they can call home adds a lot of clarity. And indeed, this was, in many ways, was obvious right from the very beginning, but this was a complete showstopper without the pension. And it's great that the pension option is now there. So you move the people into the resources into a incorporated vehicle, and suddenly you can do some things which you can't do easily without it. The first thing is you can standardize the HR, because you can create a PCN-based HR system where everybody's on the same terms and conditions, which solves the problem of the flat practice model, which is that everybody has different HR depending on which practice engages them. Secondly, of course, it solves the lead practice problem, because there isn't a practice anymore who needs to take all of the risk. The company's taking the risk, and all the shareholders have their share of that risk. And so you've effectively created the best of both worlds. You've got a flat practice because you share the risk, and you've got a single place they call home in the company. The next thing you've managed to achieve is you've to some extent achieved limited liability, because the company is the employer. So in the event something goes wrong, the liability, the starting point of that liability, is the limited company, who is the employer. And the employer then delivers the services of those people, of those staff, back to the practices. Now, it wouldn't necessarily mean you could completely avoid liability. If somebody in one of the practices discriminated or something, that would perhaps begin to open things up. But the starting point would be that you've created limited liability around those resources, which of course is great. And one of the big risks people have been saying right from the very beginning is what if, what if? So in many ways, the HR part of this is one of the big benefits you achieve through incorporation, particularly given now you can get the pension associated with it.
Thanks, Nils. So, finally, Nils, can you also talk me through the process of incorporation, of how incorporation of a PCN would work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's relatively straightforward, to be honest. The first thing you need is obviously you need a company, and you've got to decide what kind of entity that might be. But the logical thing would be a company limited by shares, and we've done quite a lot of these now, and I'm not aware of anybody who's done it in anything other than a company limited by shares. You then need to set that up in the right way. So you need to get the underlying shareholdings right, back to the practices, often by a nominee shareholder. So you need to have bespoke articles. You can obviously buy a company off the shelf, but that's not going to have the right kind of articles, the right kind of governance in it. So that would need to be written. The next thing you need is you need to put in place a subcontract, because the company is a subcontractor to the PCN, to the core network practices. The job of the company is to deliver PCN services on behalf of the core network practices. That's called a subcontract. So it's actually not just a nice to have, you actually need to have it there. According to the regulations, you need to have it there, and you actually need to notify NHS England or the CCG that you've done it, and they almost certainly will want to see that document. So that's really important, and it will also be important in terms of the trading relationship, the relationship as you add resources to say how is that being recharged and recosted. So you need that subcontract arrangement in place. And then you need to deal with the shareholding, the ownership. People will be familiar with the concept of a shareholders agreement. Yes, you need something like that, but actually our view is you can put that, if you write the right kind of PCN agreement, then logically you can put it into there, because the PCN core network practices are the shareholders. So the starting point would be probably there, but maybe separated depending on how you set it up. And lastly, you then need to move the staff in, because the staff are currently employed in one or more of the practices, and so you need to have a 2P transfer of those staff into the company, and then you can start operating your company.
So it sounds like incorporation may well address some of these risk areas, but it's clearly a new layer of complexity to primary care, which underpins the importance of using specialist professional advisors. Thank you to both Sarah and Nils for sharing their experience, and please do not hesitate to get in touch if your PCN would like to talk through some of these legal and accounting issues.